I want in this final session to I will be introducing a little bit of new content, but I also want to spend some time summing up and reflecting on the overall unit and drawing together some threads. So we'll get to that a bit later. And I realize, sort of looking through my notes and slides and things, I've probably got too much information. So I was about to think maybe I could just not have the have the slides. And I remember a friend of mine tells the story of when she was from the UK, and when she was a student, she went to see Tony Blair give a talk to students, and he started his speech by saying, "Oh, look, I've prepared these notes," and then teared them up and says, "But I want to speak to you directly. I want to," you know, and then sort of they were all massively impressed, and then afterwards they realised that that had been probably scripted and was part of his ploy.
So Humphrey had suggested it.
Anyway, so I'm not too sure to what extent I'll stick to my slides tonight. They may or may not be helpful. So in this unit as a whole, we've tended to privilege the meaning of the New Testament within its original historical context. This is the primary way in which scholars of the New Testament, scholars of the Bible more generally, would approach this collection of texts, if they were studying in a university or what have you. And we've done this primarily by drawing on a collection of tools, a collection of approaches, which come under the umbrella term of historical criticism. For example, when we talk about the genre of texts, we're doing historical criticism. What's a gospel like? What's a letter like? When we try to reconstruct the historical situation presupposed behind the letter, what was the occasion that prompted the letter, we're doing historical criticism, kind of different variant of it. When we compare the different synoptic gospel accounts side by side and look at how the different gospel authors redacted their sources, that's called redaction criticism, which is a subset of historical criticism. And I think as we've seen, and we did reflect on this a bit last week, putting texts within their historical context, their original historical context, is fairly important. And I think especially today, if we are to be, I suppose, responsible interpreters of the text, texts have power, and perhaps if there's one thing that this class has done, it suggests, you know, just how difficult biblical interpretation can actually be. It's a lot more complicated than we've sometimes been led to believe when people sort of pluck Bible verses out from here, there, and everywhere and say this is what it means. And it's like, well, actually, what it means is quite heavily contested a lot of the time. So to an extent, historical criticism allows us to realize that vast distance, both chronologically in terms of the distance in time between us and when the text was written, but also the immense cultural gulf. We're a completely different culture in the world in which we read from the world that produced these texts and the sorts of assumptions that we bring to the text and so on. But as you would have seen through the readings, some of the readings for this week, the New Testament, writings of the New Testament have been read through Christian history in numerous ways to sometimes mean radically different things. And along the way, the texts themselves have been shaped and have also shaped wider societal and cultural forces. in ways that often go far beyond the meanings within their original historical contexts. So within the reading, Mox's outlines quite a bit about what he calls reception history, which is another, I suppose, umbrella, kind of like historical criticism, but has a different focus: the effects of the text through history, through culture, not simply focusing on its birthplace, the place where the text originated, but to look at the way in which it has been shaped by broader historical forces through its life, or its afterlife, as it were. Now, because reception history is too large a topic to tackle in a single lecture, and because I also want to spend some time tonight summing up and pulling together some threads, we're just going to focus on one aspect that I want to draw your attention to, and that's the way in which the New Testament itself has been packaged quite differently through its almost 2,000 years of history. And in doing so, I'm hoping we can reflect and discuss and raise questions and thoughts about how this might affect how people engage with the text, how they read the text, and so on. So that will be, we'll do that for the first part of the class, and then in the second part we'll return to the kind of summing up. So if we're thinking about the New Testament as a physical book, well, first of all, we need to remember that the New Testament didn't exist until, or at least the canon that we have today, that collection of 27 texts, didn't really exist until the 4th century. And even at that stage, the individual texts of the New Testament were not necessarily distributed together, not in the way that you have a bound Bible today. Initially, the writings would have been written on scrolls. The individual books of the New Testament would have been written mostly on scrolls of papyrus, which is comes from Egypt, is dried, and basically like an ancient equivalent of paper. Later on, parchment tended to be used as the dominant medium or material on which the New Testament writings would appear. And of course, from that reception history point of view, the texts themselves that we have are the earliest pieces of evidence that we have for early Christianity, or for Christianity existing. So how did these writings spread around? How are they produced, and how are they spread around the empire? You'll recall that, and I think I mentioned this when we were looking at Paul, that Paul probably made use of a scribe, a professional scribe, in writing his own letters. He often signs off with his own hand, and I've got the verse numbers up on the slide, alluding to the fact that he wasn't actually the one penning these letters. Letters would then be sent by a co-worker or a slave or servant to the recipients, and they would be read aloud, perhaps on multiple occasions. And it appears that, and to a certain extent this is quite speculative, we don't have evidence for this other than the evidence of the fact that copies and copies and copies of certain texts were made, but it appears that certain texts which were deemed to be valuable, which were deemed to have something to say beyond the original contexts or addressees to which they were originally intended for, copyists would make duplications of these texts. And quite often we see what we call families of manuscripts that originate in a particular place, like Alexandria or Antioch or something like that. So it appears that from quite early on, by early on I mean within the first and second century, there were perhaps schools, Christian schools, starting to emerge where certain texts were copied and circulated. And this is the sort of the precursor to the medieval period where scribes and often monks would be trained as scribes, professional scribes, and would copy these texts within a scriptorium, within a monastery. And so they, as the picture here depicts, they would become responsible for the transmission of these texts. And I should also mention, I think, you know, this is maybe a point that I made right back at the beginning, but we don't, back at the beginning of the class, of the unit, we don't, most of or all of the texts that we have, all of the manuscripts that we have are copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. We don't have the original texts. We don't even have the first copies of the original texts, or even the grandchildren of the original text, right? We're multiple levels of transmission down the chain, and in most cases, hundreds of years at least. The earliest manuscripts that we have are fragments. They might only be, you know, a little bit of a page, and they come from the 2nd century. So we don't have anything like a complete gospel or letter until I think several centuries later, and we don't have anything resembling almost a complete New Testament until the 4th century. And we've explored a bit through the earlier on in the semester how this could lead to textual variants. So the classic case of Mark's multiple endings. It seems like the original ending got lost, and so copyists down the chain of transmission at a certain point added different endings, and then those got incorporated into the text at a certain point. And it seems that not only Christianity spread around the Roman world, not only because of its perhaps attractive theological ideas, but also due to the way in which its writings spread and the technologies that it adopted. And one of the distinctive and interesting ways in which Christians were jumping on a newish technology was their use of their preferred use of the codex. The codex is kind of a precursor to the modern book, where papers of parchment layered together, and then it's bound. And I think Moxon's in the textbook had a couple of
papyrus
paragraphs or something. Did he say it was papyrus, not parchment? It might be able to be both. You definitely can do it with parchment, but so a codex would be used instead of a scroll. And what this development meant, this is where I mean about, if we're thinking about how these texts are packaged, is that they could be read in quite different ways. So with a scroll, you would tend to read the text in a linear way. You would have the scroll open at the beginning, and you would read down until a certain point, and then you would close the scroll where you finish reading, and so if it was being read out in liturgical worship or something, right? Read it, okay, the scroll goes down. Next time it comes up, you can't start at the start of the text. You basically have to start reading from where you stopped reading, and you keep going right through to the end, and then you've got to roll it back to get it back to the beginning, kind of like a old VHS tape or something like that. Like you've got to rewind it and then play it through. It's linear in that way. Whereas a codex, like a book, enables you to flip through to different parts, easily get back to the beginning. It's funny because we're so used to books that we don't maybe see what a significant technological development this would have been. But it was. It allowed people to access these texts in quite a different and new way. And it seemed to be the preferred way in which Christians were transmitting their texts. And so they are described, Christians are described early on as a bookish people, referring to this, their preference for the codex. Another implication of this is that it was possible, and it did happen, where different texts in the New Testament would be bundled together. I don't actually know, I can't think of the top of my head of the earliest complete New Testament of 27 books. There's a really famous early New Testament, which was actually where the photo on the slide is from, called Codex Sinaiticus, which is held in the British Library in London. And that's from the 4th century, and it includes the New Testament, but also a couple of other books that aren't in the New Testament. So this idea of a kind of malleable canon was still, happening at that point in time. But even from the 2nd century, you had, say, collections of Paul's letters, or some of Paul's letters, circulating together. So texts were not just circulating as individual texts, but put together, and put in codex form means you could not only turn to anywhere in the letter, you could turn to different books, and it was very convenient, and so on and so forth. One thing that needs to be pointed out, and on the next slide you'll see why, is that books, this way of manufacturing books was very labor intensive and expensive. And so individuals and individual Christians did not have their own Bibles or their own copies of different New Testament texts. In the medieval period, texts would be housed within libraries, within churches and monasteries and so on. And I think, I don't know when this practice started, but there was a tendency to connect a chain to a Bible and chain it to the pulpit within a church, so that it wouldn't get stolen, because they were so valuable. And what this meant was that not many people read these texts for themselves. They would often hear it read to them, perhaps most often in the context of worship. There wasn't this kind of individual Bible study or whatever. So I think that the way in which people engaged with these texts was quite different to the sort of the ordinary Christian, everyday Christian today. Any comments or questions at this point?
There is in Hereford a whole library that is chained.
Right.
Dozens, possibly hundreds of books. Just a comment. And following what you've said, one assumes that the existence of the New Testament could only occur when the scroll was transformed into the codex. When a collection of 27, 23, 29 books would be a pile of scrolls.
Right, yeah. But interestingly, we don't really see, and I'm struggling to, so the next slide is about printing press, right? And I'm struggling to think of an example. I don't want to make a sort of absolute claim in case I'm wrong about this, but there was no New Testament as such, as a single book, standardized book, prior to the invention of the printing press. So there may be an example of it somewhere, but you're right when you say whether it was 23 books, 27, the evidence that we have points in that direction, that the collection changed, or it was just Paul's letters, or it was just the 4 Gospels, or but a complete and only the New Testament, or even the Bible, as it were, 66 books of the Bible.
Depends what Bible you're looking
It will exactly as well. I'm going to mention something about that as well. Didn't really happen. There may be, and I'm saying this and I'm trying to be careful, there may be 1 or 2 examples, but the earliest examples absolutely aren't standardized in this way. The printing press is the next dramatic technological shift.
So you don't count Sinaiticus?
Because Sinaiticus has additional texts. So
that has a few
additional non-canonical or not deuterocanonical. So it's got Shepherd of Hermes and one other, I can't remember what it is, but they're books that aren't canonical or deuterocanonical.
But it's almost there.
But it's almost there, and that's the closest.
That's the 4th century in Luxembourg. It is.
But there's very little between. Yeah.
So we got about 1,000 years.
Yeah.
I've got visions of you know, you're talking about these scrolls. Got visions of these scrolls having like numbers on, like our posters do. You know, in buying posters in Kmart. And because you could be picking up any old scroll, how would you know what scroll is what?
Well, you know when you read the first line.
Oh, sorry, that's not the right one. Put that one back.
Yeah. But often the title of the work is the first line. So something, and this is how we know that the texts were probably originally written on scrolls, not codices. We think of, for example, beginning of the book of Revelation. It's the revelation of, you know, it starts with the title of the book. The Gospels, remember, they're anonymous. They don't actually say this is the Gospel of Mark. This is the good news of Jesus Christ. This, you know, so you're familiar with what the first line of the text, and that's the title. Yeah.
We're very heavily focused on a written record. Surely at this time, oral was important in terms of, from the Jewish culture, many people tried to learn great sections or complete books of the Bible orally.
That wasn't that. Yeah, that's interesting, because that was a practice within Jewish culture.
Yeah.
I don't know the extent to which that may have existed within.
Is that because people couldn't read?
Well, I mean, that we have to take that for granted, that, you know,
Get books.
significant proportions of the population are illiterate. But within, and this is why, for example, monasteries become scholarly communities as such, where people are trained in literacy and there it could be quite feasible that they would be well acquainted with the text, but the kind of the ordinary populace working labouring in the farms, wherever they're, you know, it wouldn't have been quite the same. So anyway, the printing press is a significant change in terms of how the Bible was produced and distributed, and you know, had massive implications for and important implications for the development of Christian history itself, including in part playing a role in the Protestant Reformations, the rise of ideas, but also the rise of ideas about the Bible as itself being an authority, perhaps that rival, an authority that could even rival the authority of, say, the Pope. The texts were suddenly made available to ordinary readers in a way that was unprecedented to that point, because the cost was so low. So you have from this period of the 15th century, even though literacy still remains quite low for those who were literate and could read, a turn to more individual reading. People able to, you know, read the text for themselves at home. Not something that it was available to everyone before this point. And interestingly, I think that has historically given rise to this idea of, you know, a kind of more personal encounter with the text, and that people could, because people are free to make meanings with these texts as they see fit in their own time, and that's become legitimized as an appropriate way of reading the text. Prior to the Protestant Reformation, for the most part, the church told you what the text meant. From that point on, the text properly interpreted told you what the church should be saying. You know, it kind of got reversed. That's a really kind of too rough way of putting it, but hopefully you get the point. So also, you know, translations were made. Now a Latin translation had been a standard translation up until this point, translated from the Greek that the New Testament writings were originally written in, but suddenly you have translations to the vernacular, English, German, and so on. Again, making this text more accessible, but interestingly, along with it, anyone who knows another language will know that you can never translate something perfectly. There's no perfect translation. It's always a bit of an approximation. Either you end up saying slightly more than what the original said, or you say less or something, and that's exactly what New Testament translation is like. People read their English Bibles, and often some of the words or phrases or what have you may be far more ambiguous in the original Greek. What we also have, and I think this is significant, is the standardized form of the text. So there's a couple of ways of looking at this. One is to think about it in terms of, you know, depending on the translation, but let's say the King James Bible, they're all the same in terms of the text, at least. Whereas you look at any two manuscripts, any two codices, and they have differences. They will have spelling errors, they will have verses dropped off, words changed, whatever. So that was the standard, that was the norm up until that point in time, that the text had variations within different copies of it. And suddenly you have this kind of standardization. Everybody's reading the same text, potentially with the same errors in it, you know, but another way of looking at this is to think in terms of the actual books that are in the New Testament. or in the Bible. Given that the canon, at least according to Moxon's, was never fully settled, and there is some kind of ambiguities around the edges, the printing press definitely, I think, kind of settled the canons in various and interesting ways. If you're, I don't know how familiar you are with the apocryphal or deuterocanonical books, but these, so some Bibles will have them, and particularly if you've got a modern study Bible, mine's the New Oxford Annotated Bible, same one, I think, and it's really great. It's got, you know, notes by scholars and so on all over it, but it also contains a number of books that are neither in the standard Old Testament or New Testament. Depending on which community you come from, they're either called the apocryphal books, apocryphal just meaning hidden or whatever, or deuterocanonical, secondary canon. Now, and interestingly, within Anglicanism, the 39 Articles does list these books as being deuterocanonical. So they are part of the canons of, or the canon, biblical canon of our church, but in a kind of secondary status. So these books were written in between the periods of the writing of the Old Testament, which was written in Hebrew, and the New Testament. Some of the texts were written into the New Testament period, and they're written in Greek, but they are Jewish texts. And from a historian's point of view, from an academic point of view, they're some of my favorite texts because they provide the immediate backdrop to what happens in the New Testament. Because they're texts that were written, you know, whether 50 years, 100 years, 200 years before Jesus, whereas the final Old Testament text we've written, you're talking still 5th century, so significantly earlier. Now, it's one of the perhaps almost accidents of history that most modern Bibles don't have these deuterocanonical texts within them. It's simply cheaper to print a Bible with the primary canons, the Old and New Testaments, and that seemed to become standard practice for the most part. Now, some Protestant denominations do reject the deuterocanonical books, so that was kind of, you know, that settled that for them. But you know, it's phenomenal because again, where prior to the printing press we had a bit of variation. So you know, you could have a New Testament which had a couple of extra texts with it, or you could include the deuterocanonical texts or whatever, because the canon wasn't necessarily this. The canon was a concept or a list of books, and this may or may not include all or some or most of them. But the printing press led to this kind of standardization. And these decisions were kind of then left up to the discretion of publishers, churches, and so on, in terms of what was included and what wasn't. So, any questions or comments?
At the time of the King James Version, did they consider whether any of these secondary sources should be included?
I don't believe that they're in the King James Version, but I don't know. I don't know if it was. I'm sure it was considered, but I don't know to what extent it was considered.
Because that the decision had to be made about what to retranslate.
Yeah. And I mean, to be fair, you know, within Anglicanism and Catholicism, there is a sense in which the deuterocanonical books are deuterocanonical, but it's like I'm assuming some of you had never heard of them up until tonight, because I had never heard of them up until I went to study at university. I'd never encountered these texts before, and I was suddenly like, oh wow, like all these, you know, missing books of the Bible, and it perhaps is one of these things that shouldn't come as a surprise to us. They're still part of our tradition, even if they're not part of the primary canon.
Well, the two are slightly pornographic, I seem to recall.
Right.
So that may partially explain that. It was slightly on one side.
I mean, the ones that I'm most familiar with are the stories of this 1, 2, 3, and 4 Maccabees, and they're particularly violent, but not necessarily any more violent than some of the Old Testament texts. And actually, this is where you start to get. This is again why it's interesting from a historical perspective. You start to get, for the first time in Jewish culture, ideas about resurrection in some of these books, and the Maccabees, they, in particular, but start to formulate these ideas of, oh, if we die as glorious martyrs for the Jewish nation, God will raise us back to life. So interesting stuff's happening in this period, in what's called the intertestamental period. It wasn't a kind of black hole of of nothingness. So if we shift through, you know, we're doing a pretty fast sweep of history, aren't we? But so the modern period, broadly construed, the Bible on the back of the technological developments of the printing press and the Industrial Revolution and colonialism and the expansion of not only European civilization, but, you know, religion, Christian religion, that often went hand in hand with that. You have the expansion of capitalism as this political economic system that is now a global political economic system, which we all live within, and as a major part of that, we are consumers. Everything we do is basically about what we consume from the market. And within this context, under capitalism, the New Testament itself has become a consumer product. Interestingly, the Bible is the most printed book of all time. It's the #1 best-selling book of all time, and yet publishers are intent on selling even more. How do you sell a book that's already been sold multiple times, you know, and so on and so forth? I got the question earlier, we'll come back to that. To give you an illustration of how publishers have thought about this, I could turn to any product that does this, but razors seem to be the thing that comes to my mind. You know, Gillette Mach 3, the best a man can get. How do you sell even more razors? Well, you also figure out another demographic that you can package the exact same product in a slightly different way, and you can sell even more. You can sell twice as many. Right? So this is a real basic marketing strategy that is applied to everything from toothpaste to schools, where you send your children to school, to whatever. There's slight variation, and Bibles have not been immune to this, right? So I've got some of the more eccentric Bibles. I actually have a collection of, when I visit secondhand bookstores, I get all the stupid, ridiculous branded Bibles that you can find. I've got a strange collection of these things, but we've got here ones that are mostly sort of marketed to teenagers. Got the Extreme Faith Bible, the NASCAR stock car racing Holy Bible, the Revolution Bible for teen boys, the True Images for Bible for teen girl, you know, so every kind of segment, possible segment of the market, there is a Bible for that demographic. And it's not just the cover, it's the way in which the whole layout is spaced out. So the True Images Bible for Teen Girls is kind of like a magazine. It's in a magazine format with kind of gossipy columns on the side explaining what, you know, Zechariah was really up to, or and the Revolution for Teen Boys has similar kind of articles about, you know, what it means to be a real man and all this stuff. So it's interesting because you've got, from a reception history point of view, what we call a paratext, which is the text that's alongside the text that is within this package of a Bible, is suggesting to you things about what the text may mean or be associated with, which would not at all be obvious to someone reading a codex or even a kind of, you know, no frills Bible from the 16th century or something like that. And even then, you know, the way in which it's packaged really changes things. And looking around, you know, the room, we can see that everybody here basically has a different kind of Bible. I was talking fondly of my study Bible, but again, like obviously me as a New Testament scholar, I'm going to have consumed and purchased the Bible that is designated for my, you know, I'm consuming my identity by in engaging with this text. So back to that question down the bottom of it, you know, what are the implications for how we understand, first of all, what the Bible is?
The storybook.
And well, children's Bibles are another variation on this. Actually, I should include it in my slide the next time. I came across a great image of that someone had shared online of a children's Bible of the story of Jesus turning water into wine. And it was Jesus turned water into juice. I thought, yeah, that's pretty easy because you just get that sachet stuff from water in it. But no, so you know, I mean, children's Bibles are particularly interesting because they very often really depart from the text and sanitize some of the ugly parts. And
but they wouldn't sell other than they meet a need. Like I might need,
or a market, yeah.
like, I might need bigger printed text.
Yes.
It's easier to read. Or I like, you know, I like the annotations, but some of the annotations are brief, and others are quite extensive. And I think that's when the next move on into the digital, we suddenly open up the whole range of what can be annotated.
So interesting to think about this in terms of, and I guess my point, like I present this in quite a cynical way, but I think there's both positives and negatives about the way in which the Bible is packaged in any format. And I think one of the positives is you're pulling out is that we can really engage with a kind of somewhat personalized, you know, version of the text that suits us. And we're sort of moving away from that standardized. It's still standardized to an extent, but it's not standardized in the way of when the printing press first emerged, and you basically had, you know, 3 versions of, or one version, you know, the authorized version in English, the King James, and there wouldn't be too much difference in terms of how it would be printed and bound.
In Mowbray's, which is the religious bookshop in Breville, you could get, there are great piles of Bibles bound in white leather, brides to hold when they get married. They probably didn't open it again. So
yeah,
a very particular niche Bible.
a Bible for every occasion.
And until relatively recently, in Britain, wasn't it only 2 or 3 presses, Oxford and Cambridge and one other, were allowed to print it? I mean, obviously it doesn't apply now, but I think within living memory, or certainly grandparents' living memory, Oxford, Cambridge and
That's interesting. I didn't know that. It's interesting because all of these, and there's about 100 different variations of this kind of, are all from Zondervan, which is an American-based publisher, who are actually owned by HarperCollins. So that's Zondervan is their kind of evangelical Christian wing of the bigger conglomerate, but it's like a massive media company. So it's sort of that's an interesting kind of point of contrast. That of course this would come out of America, that more hyper-capitalist space. I mean, it's funny because I use these images. I have in undergraduate teaching, and so some of the students might just be out of high school or whatever, and they look so unimpressed with these. Like this is not in any way like what they want to be reading, or they just cringe. Yeah. But in some contexts they might be. Yeah.
some people like them.
Clearly, some people do, because clearly they sell to some people. But I wonder if I do wonder if it's the case that these are the Bibles that parents or grandparents buy their, thinking, oh yes, this will get them reading the Bible. And again, it's put on the shelf and not kind of. So yeah, moving along to the digital text. Today, again, I think another very monumental technological change is the fact we're living in this digital world. We can encounter the New Testament as a digital text. I quite often, when I'm doing some work, and I have vague memories of a verse or something, but I can't quite remember where it was or what it was. You just Google a few words of it, instantly, oh, John 3:10 or whatever, it has sort of revolutionized the way in which we are able to engage with the text. And think about it in terms of when the early Christians adopted the Codex, how they could flip to different sections of the book, and it would operate in quite a different way in terms of how they engage with it. Well, this again changes our engagement with it, and I think it both has positives and negatives. Positives might be easy to locate text, but a negative, I mean, not only is it often difficult to read on the screen, but it seems in our day and age, and this I think was perhaps happening before the advent of the digital text, but it's definitely helped by the digital text. A focus down on kind of single verses, or people don't tend to read a text through in its entirety. From I'm going to sit down, I'm going to read the Gospel of Mark because it's a book that I can read from start to finish. Rather, this technology tends to lend itself to what's digestible on the screen, and digital culture itself has moved more and more to bite-sized chunks of information, or more.
That's why you have the audio books, and you can go to bed and you can just listen to your audio book. Audiobooks are again another interesting variation actually on this. What I always find interesting is how, what are they adding in terms of, like, how does Jesus sound? How do different characters sound? The emphasis on the words, the way in which it's performed, the sound effects. Jesus is casting out a demon, is it, all sorts of noises, and
I think a key factor in audio is the speed is slower than if you were reading. And so it's more, it's potentially easier to take in because you're not being pushed quite so fast.
You definitely hear, you take in different details. That's for certain.
Well, then you've got your YouTube, which is different again,
Yeah.
Yeah.
because they're sort of reading it to you, but then they're also putting their spin on it.
Yeah.
And there's, so you've got the real sort of, I actually quite like listening to that too, but it's interesting to listen to that and then listen to something else that just exactly on the same thing. But what you said earlier about how when you're reading something, you get an idea of what's how someone sounds. I was reading Barack Obama's book, and one night I thought, I can't bother to look at this, I'll just put it up on audio. Totally different the way because he was doing it himself.
Right. Yeah.
It was so much more interesting the way he was reading it than I was reading it.
Yeah. If only Mark could read Mark.
Exactly.
But in a way, the audio versions, it's really interesting because it does sort of almost take us back to how Christians through most of Christian history would have heard it. Not exactly in that way that it was being performed, but as a performance.
Well, then you've also got the sort of thing on radio as well when they're doing it. I remember being back in UK listening to it, and they've got sound effects in the background as they're reading it. They're someone's pretending to be one person, the other one's pretending to be God, and you've got these sort of sound effects in the background. It's really quite fascinating. Just a joke.
The Galilean swine.
When I think about this, one of the things that I sort of lament about digital culture is this way in which it moves towards the bite-sized chunks of content. So nothing is long form anymore. If you've heard of the TikTok app, it's like 30-second videos, and so anyone under, I don't know, 25 this is one of the main apps that they're using these days, and they'll just scroll through 20-30-second videos of interesting things or whatever, and I noticed this in terms of my university teaching as well to undergrads, is that they didn't really read, or they didn't read, most of them didn't, they struggled to read, especially kind of longer, more demanding things in a way that, and I realise I'm younger than most, if not all of you, but all of you, yes. But for me, it was like I read as growing up, and that was something that I noticed in the students that I'm teaching, is that they don't read. So if they are to engage with the Bible, and when I was teaching them the Bible, they're looking it up on their phones, and so on, and they're engaging with it in such a different way to the way in which I was or you are. And again, that's both a blessing and a curse.
How do they manage with a plain textbook like the Watson's one we're using? They find that very heavy and wouldn't be able to get through a chapter?
I think it's mixed. It's definitely mixed. I think that for a number of the students, these days, it's quite a culture shock when they start university, and particularly in a reading heavy discipline like theology, and they realise how much reading is involved, and that it's not all going to be spoon-fed, that it is, you've got to work at it.
You use the word scroll, so we're back to the start.
That's a really great observation.
So you scroll through the text just as they did in Antioch in 95.
So the next development will be some kind of digitized codex. Because I have a Kindle, but that doesn't that's not the same because a Kindle you can't actually do literally this. You can't go like that.
No.
It's actually more like a scroll where you read from start to finish. It's great for fiction or whatever, but you can't, you know, it's, yeah. All right, that's a good time for a break, I think. Okay, so moving on from those ideas, I'm going to come to draw together some of the overarching threads. This is the part of the lecture where I think that the slides don't really matter so much. You'll have them, you'll have the video and the slides will be uploaded on Moodle if you want to look at the detail later on. But because I'm sort of repeating myself with it, yeah, I'm not going to go through everything that's on every slide. So one of the major emphases of this unit has been the diversity that exists within early Christianity. What eventually became, as we saw in particular last week, what eventually became Orthodox Christianity, as represented in the creeds, councils, and established doctrines of most Christian churches, took centuries to develop. It didn't spring from all at once from the teachings of Jesus or any prominent disciple of Jesus as such. This idea that they were all more or less on the same page and there was one kind of orthodox teaching from the beginning has been shown to not really be feasible. And we've seen this diversity not only in terms of the theologies of the different writings within the New Testament that we've looked at. If we were to look at other writings by early writings by Christians and so on, outside of the New Testament, we would see further diversity. So there's diversity in terms of theology, but there's also diversity in terms of, not unrelatedly, their Christology, their view of Jesus, whether these texts or Christian groups behind these texts held a relatively elevated view of Jesus, like the Gospel of John, where Jesus is basically God come down to earth, versus other writings which have more of a low Christology, where Jesus appears much more human and down to earth, and there aren't as many exalted claims and so on. Now, it appears that both views existed from fairly early on. It was simply that there was this diversity of views within the earliest churches. But the New Testament also shows diversity in terms of the genre, in terms of the genres that are the types of literature that are included within it. And again, this sort of means that we can't just pick up the New Testament, turn to any part of it, and expect to be able to interpret what it means straight away, or read it in the same way. We read a gospel very differently from how we read a letter, from how we might read an apocalyptic text like the book of Revelation. So with the letters, we were very much concerned with not only thinking about how the letter conforms or doesn't conform to typical letter writing style, but also the assumed occasion behind the author's purpose for writing, and also the fact that we only have one half of the correspondence. With the Gospels, remember we made that comparison to Greco-Roman biographies, the telling of a story of a great individual, and sort of all the baggage that goes along with that. It was a stylized way of presenting a person that focused on their good deeds and often their miraculous exploits and their teachings and so on and so forth. And so the way in which Jesus is presented to us is in exactly that way. But of course, again, we have that variation between the four Gospels themselves. But also, there's diversity in terms of what we might call the politics and the social views of the early Christian groups, whether it's early Christian groups that had different views about the place of woman within the church, in terms of the values of the wider patriarchal world. But also varying understandings of whether allegiance to Jesus as Christ meant that there would be no compromise to Rome at all, that you could not compromise one iota of the law, as in Matthew or the book of Revelation, or a more accommodating, mediating position, like as is assumed by the author of Luke and Acts. Remember, in the book of Acts, Paul is portrayed both as a faithful Jew, but also as a Roman citizen, and through that narrative somehow manages to have both aspects of his identity working for him quite well and in interesting ways, and in a way that seems to be quite opposed to how, say, the author of the book of Revelation may have seen things politically. Another major emphasis has been on the Jewish origins of Christianity. So I said this a number of times through the unit, that when these texts were being written, there was no such thing as Christianity that existed as this separate religion, but what is often described as the parting of the ways, where what becomes Judaism and what becomes Christianity gradually split apart, was this gradual process that didn't really get going until in the late 1st century. And one of the major factors behind that, or two major factors, one was the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So the Jewish people themselves suddenly became, without a kind of central governing authority for their religious identity, the temple. The people themselves became much more dispersed and so on. But the other major factor behind this parting of the ways was the fact that the church had become far more Gentile or non-Jewish than Jewish. And this started to create problems for some communities. So if you recall back to when we looked at John's Gospel, there's this reference to followers of Jesus being thrown out of the synagogue, which is something that didn't happen in Jesus's lifetime, but was quite plausibly happening towards the end of the 1st century, where these tensions were really flaring up. Any questions or comments? A third major emphasis has been, and these are the three main emphases. So take a note of these: was the diversity in early Christianity, the Jewish origins of Christianity, and the third is the apocalypticism. The fact that the earliest people within this movement, Jesus, Paul, and some of the writers of our texts, held an apocalyptic worldview, a Jewish apocalyptic worldview. Apocalypticism, in the form that we were looking at, existed within certain sectors of Jewish society at the time. And it was this worldview that was very expectant of the world being radically transformed by God. Along with this, you had messianic hopes of a great figure or leader coming in and freeing the nation of Israel from their foreign oppressors, in the case of the 1st century, from the Romans. And so apocalyptic beliefs within this Jewish manifestation always went hand in hand with opposition to the ruling powers. And as we've seen, this is something that gets negotiated and muted in some of the texts in the New Testament. But within, for the earliest Christians at least, when they would have made the proclamation that Jesus is Lord, and when they talked about the kingdom of God coming to earth and so on, they were literally talking about the displacement of the Roman Empire and Caesar as the rightful Lord of the world. And so, yes, I introduced this term, I think, last week about the proto-Orthodox movement. So what we today think of as orthodoxy were just one party among a number of groups of Christians, but this particular group, the proto-Orthodox movement, who ultimately came to become the ascendant group of Christians whose views are today represented within the New Testament. We saw this coming through quite strongly in the pastoral epistles, that part of their agenda was calling for the church's unity, insisting on the church's doctrinal purity in terms of developing creedal statements and boundaries of who's in and who's out and so on, and establishing this through stressing the importance of the church's leadership, not only who can hold post stations, but what those within who occupy those offices of the church's leadership were responsible for implementing within the churches, namely the doctrinal purity and unity and so on. And in the 2nd century, we have the beginnings of truly upper class educated people entering the ranks of the churches. So up until this point, Christianity, there has been some dispute over this as to whether earliest Christianity was a religion of the poor. I think by the time the New Testament texts were written, you've got people from varying social backgrounds, social locations, class locations engaged in these communities, from slaves through to more well-to-do, but nobody who's really truly elite. You don't have kind of Roman office holders or governors of cities or that sort of thing. And this sort of thing starts to happen from around the 2nd century onwards. And along the way, some of them move towards turning this religious movement more into something of a philosophy. So it engages, or some of its intellectual and wealthy adherents defend a Christian view of the world, or develop a Christian view of the world up against the other major ideas of the age, of the Greco-Roman world. Platonism, Stoicism, and so on. You have proper kind of philosophical musings of this. And I think this in part is where Christianity becomes more and more expressed in this kind of belief system sort of way. But another interesting factor is the rise in this period of Christian asceticism and monasticism, and certain people leading and living religious lives away from the kind of what they see as the corruptions of the Roman world. And of course, they have their texts to choose from within the New Testament that would point in this direction. But perhaps the most important event in the historical establishment of Christianity, its eventual triumph, so to speak, over the Roman world. And I think this is an important thing to remember, is that in a sense, you know, Christianity began as this kind of anti-Roman, or at least the implication was anti-Roman, you know, a new kingdom coming to earth to replace this one. And actually that's what happened in a sense. It was still called the Roman Empire. It was still ruled by Caesar. It just happened that Caesar was Christian. And Christianity became a legal religion, a favored religion. And a century after Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor of Rome, a century after, Christianity then becomes the legal religion of the Roman Empire itself. And it's hard to underestimate the significance of this transition in terms of shaping the afterlife of Christianity, because we read the New Testament through the lens of not some kind of marginal cult that, you know, had some interesting ideas or whatever, but we read it through the lens of a religious movement that truly ascended to become a kind of the ideology of global power, first in the Roman Empire, but then through Europe, then through colonization of the globe. We read these texts in the aftermath of a religion that has dominated the world, and that is so different from where things started out, and where we started out in the student, right? When we're talking about a marginal nation conquered by Rome, that the founder of this movement was crucified by the power holders of the day. This is such a significant upheaval. And it's really hard to, as I say, not to underestimate the significance of this. That what began as a ragtag bunch of poor, illiterate Jewish peasants from the marginalized empire eventually became part of the religion of or the official religion of the Roman Empire itself. And sort of for more perspective, during his own lifetime, Jesus of Nazareth was relatively unimportant. Even if he did make a bit of an impact, nobody in the empire had heard of him outside of Galilee and Palestine during his own lifetime. It wasn't until missionaries 10, 20, whatever, 100 years later, took this message around that people first began to hear of the legend of Jesus. It had become legendary already by that point. But in his own day, he didn't conquer Rome. He didn't do what was expected of a traditional Messiah and so on. And in its earlier stages, Christianity was, you know, extremely diverse and weak. But again, we now engage these texts as in a world in which Christianity is considered a major world religion. And you know, how did this happen? Why did this happen? I think one of the lessons of a unit like this one is to help us to figure out that we can't actually answer this question with any kind of one-line simple solution or explanation. It's really complicated. This whole area of study is really complicated and complex and messy, and these are some of the reasons why. It's part of the messiness of history, I think, rather than due to any inherent quality of the New Testament or ancient Christianity itself that caused it to go in the direction that it did. So that is the end of my content, but I am very interested in, and we will obviously finish it a little bit early, but I am interested in hearing from you about what you found perhaps most interesting, but also most challenging from the unit as a whole. I won't pick on every single person, but I would like to hear from as many people as would like to answer that.
I think the thing that has struck me, because I'm sort of more used to a linear world where things make sense, and being an administrator, well, you make them make sense even if they don't. In this sort of environment, I'm thinking, how the heck did they actually come up with anything in the end? Because there's so much diversity and there were so many different groups, and communication wasn't as clear-cut as it is for us today. Everything was taking place over quite a long time frame, and there would be generations of people involved. It wasn't just one set of people, and you wonder, well, what got passed down between them? And by the time you got to the end here, was it anything like what the people at the beginning had envisaged?
The question of sort of was it more a process of sort of Chinese whispers,
Yeah.
or yeah, what yeah, and that's a really interesting question to think about.
I mean, the fact they've actually managed to get anything together at all, I think, is quite remarkable.
I found the influence of the Roman Empire. I didn't quite realize when I first started this how huge the sort of, I suppose, stretch was across Europe. You know, I mean, you hear about it, but I didn't realize, how massive it was, and how, when you look at like Revelations and sort of it's sort of compared to the Roman Empire, and just the impact that the Roman Empire had on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
And I think, yeah, often people assume or treat the Roman Empire as kind of the background or the broader background of the New Testament, whereas I've really tried to make it the foreground, because I think it was, and in the same that, it's nowhere near to the extent, but we live in Australia, and what we do is in response to what's happening in the Australian context, politically, socially, economically. That's how you interpret the world. It's through what's happening. So I think that the Roman Empire was as quite a sort of totalitarian state, imposing its will everywhere. It's not background.
But it's interesting to compare that setting that you've stressed in your talks with what you hinted on a few minutes ago, the role of colonialism. Other empires, obviously British, but French, Spanish, they were all at it.
Yeah.
They were,
and oftentimes modeling themselves on Rome.
Exactly so. So
Self-conscious.
it's nice to see it's interesting to see the comparisons.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting book that came out 1 or 2 years ago called The Bible in Australia, which is a cultural history of the Bible, as the title suggests, sort of, and it's a reception history actually of the Bible in Australia. But that whole question of, well, why is it here? Well, the answer actually is colonialism. It wouldn't be here without that, and that gives it such a complicated legacy in this country, that when we wield this text, whether in church or in public or whatever, it's a colonial tool and weapon and what have you, as well as being a document of faith and enrichment and so on. And so it's interesting and it's complicated, and lots of questions arise from that.
When I was in about, I suppose, the equivalent of year 9 or 10, the teacher said to me that colonialism was 3 things: men, money, and ideas. And the greatest of these 3 is ideas. Colonialism, Captain Cook, Philip, money, railways, farmland, ideas,
and you know,
English law and the New Testament.
Certain texts were pretty pivotal in this. The one that immediately comes to mind is the conclusion of Matthew's Gospel, which commands the disciples to go out and make disciples of all nations, and this was seen as this justification for colonial endeavours. Any other thoughts? Or
I think I didn't really realise the influence of apocalyptic thinking, and what it actually meant, and that people were talking about the new world as being right here in front of them and not just in heaven, and also that they believed it was imminent, and how that influenced their thinking and their choices. That was a real eye-opener. Yeah.
Again, it's hard to sometimes identify with that, because we've had 2,000 years of that not happening.
Yes.
So yeah, but for the writers of those early texts, and for Paul and for Jesus, this is imminent, this is happening soon, and it's happening here. Yeah.
2 observations. One is that deliberately we focused on what I would consider to be the media rather than the content of the story. And I assume that's because there's a different type of analysis needed for spiritual content than what we were doing with the physical presence of the New Testament documentation. And I think that has to be part of the total picture of our understanding. The second observation relates to the fundamentalist Christians tend to have this is the absolute truth and this is the way it's going. I don't quite know where to slot in that belief in the way we're analysing the things that, you know, there really is going to be thunder and hailstones and 1,000 years exactly to the minute, that type of thing. And it's happening because I was listening to a particular spiel on that last night.
I think fundamentalist Christians tend to reject outright historical criticism.
Yes.
Yeah. In fact, fundamentalism was largely formed as a reaction against historical criticism. So at the beginning of the 20th century, these groups of American Christians, conservative American Christians, who were very concerned about the way in which these theories emerging from Germany were eroding the faith and sort of watering it down and so on. And as they perceived it, this was not, and still isn't, a kind of universe. I don't, but this is their perspective. This was their perspective. So they published a pamphlet called "The Fundamentals of the Faith," which had, and this is where the name fundamentalism comes from. So they define their own fundamentals, but interestingly, they're quite they're quite focused on a particular dimension of Christianity that was actually being threatened. Not really the full picture, but anyway, they would insist fundamentally on the literal interpretation of Scripture. I'm not going to be able to get through all five, but I think the bodily, physical resurrection of Jesus, so as a historical event, which is I think within historical criticism a complicated thing to discuss, and the objective reality of miracles, again within historical criticism, a difficult thing to discuss. Now, when I say that, people sometimes hear what I'm not saying, which is that it didn't happen or historical criticism says it doesn't happen. No, it's just these are kind of scientific tools of analysis. You can't apply them to supernatural kind of things. It just doesn't work. The inerrancy of Scripture. I think the virgin birth was the final one, but I may be confusing or missing out something. But yeah, and then interestingly, more fundamentalist religions have tended to coalesce around those sorts of beliefs, and also interestingly, you know, issues of in more recent decades, issues of gender and sexuality and so on.
So a first century Christian probably wasn't a literal interpreter, because they saw the symbolism of a lot of what was being written.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you only really can become a literalist in the modern era, where you have this rise of scientific ways of believing and knowing. And prior to that, for the most part, it would be true. It wasn't really a question. There was definitely, in the rise of the modern era, a different understanding of what constituted truth. So for the ancients, it would be, truth was defined sort of by tradition. So what was true came through tradition and from authority. So that's how you knew something was true. And the New Testament authors sometimes talk in that way, you know, this tradition that was passed on to us from our elders, and that's why we know it's true, and blah, blah, blah. So they're assuming something that was widely assumed through the ancient world. In the modern era, with the rise of scientific ways of thinking and knowing, we have a more rational way of discerning what's true. True is what can be proven through evidence, rational argument, and so on and so forth. So that's become a dividing line for Christians, I think, in the last several centuries, as you'll discover in some of the other units in the certificate.
I think for me, reading it in this historical method, I see it more as philosophical, and I can see the mythology in it because it's been put into the context of when it was written. I think I've got a greater appreciation for it as a result.
Yeah, I mean, because part of the task is to make cross-cultural comparisons, and that's always really illuminating. Anybody else want to share their wisdom?
Lack of it.
Surely not. Not by this stage.
But millennialism keeps on recurring, doesn't it? It goes quiet for a bit. Or was it 30 years ago that someone in Adelaide, South Australia, was saying that the tide's going to come up on such a day at such a time, and literally hundreds, if not thousands, of people went to the Adelaide Hills, and then there was the millennium bug, and all the computers of the world were going to collapse, and the aircraft were going to crash. the power stations would go berserk and so on. But you can see every few years there's something. All right, 1,000 years they thought it was going to be something nasty, and then the millennium bug, and then
And
it's always there.
yeah, looking at popular culture and the number of movies and so on, which are focused on end of the world thinking, and you know, currently in the midst of a pandemic, so and this is,
But there again, that always happens, doesn't it?
well, that's the thing, isn't it? The
Yeah.
crises
Yeah.
are a constant of human history. There's always been conflicts or natural disasters,
Wars.
all sorts of things that push people in that direction. If we're going to understand it from a kind of more sociological perspective.
That's very often over land.
And then you've got that thought, is it going to push them towards turning to religion, or is it going to turn them away from religion as well? So everyone's sort of everyone thought that in the time of what's my dad saying, when they had the is it smallpox, when they had the smallpox that came out, that they thought it was the ones that were less educated thought that it was something that was being, because they had done the wrong, you know, they were bad people, they were doing the wrong things, they had turned to Christ. Yeah.
I remember reading some interesting things at the start of this pandemic about similar like predictions about, oh, people will turn back to religion or whatever, because I think the opposite seems to be happening, and it's actually been because of COVID restrictions. It might not be, I don't know the extent to which this is happening here, but definitely in places where they've had more severe lockdowns and so on. Once the restrictions are eased, people don't go back to church. Sort of, so they've had massive drop off. Yeah, and they realise, oh, I don't need this anymore. I can sleep in on a Sunday.
Then you've got the way of looking at it as well is that people then had it online. And so some churches actually picked up more and they stayed.
Yeah, that's true.
A lot of the elderly couldn't make it to church. They didn't, but now they can, because one of their reddies have given them a computer and set it up for them. So now they can actually join in. So we on the plate we had less collection on the plate, but then suddenly our collection picked up with the direct debit thing.
Yeah.
So we've actually did better from that.
Yeah.
You asked the question, why did this happen? I think taking the New Testament as a whole, it really is a story to give us hope. And I think it appeals to a human need, that it's not just what we're at, it's that where we might go to. Despite all the terror and horror and other things that are promoted in there, the underlying story is still one of hope.
Yeah, I think at a level, what most of the texts in the New Testament, if not all of them, most of them are pointing to is that, is the sense in which where we're at now, isn't it? Whether it's the kingdom of God coming to earth, radically changing it, or whatever the metaphor that's used, that I think comes through quite strongly.
One thing that I've wondered about was the actual order in which the books are within the Bible. Obviously, the Gospels at the beginning, one expects that, and Revelation at the end, but the lot in the middle, is that just haphazard collection, or is there?
There is a logic to the order. Paul's letters are grouped together, and they're ordered from longest to shortest. Then you've got the sort of the other letters. So there is a kind of logic to that. it's not something I've looked into in terms of when these lists are written, whether the orders are changed quite often. But I would suspect that this might be one of the byproducts of the printing press, printing them in a particular canonical order forever.
Okay.
Because I do know in some languages and translations, the books might appear in a slightly different order. In Jewish Bibles, for example, the Old Testament, the books are in a different order. So they have the same canon. Well, it's the Jewish canon, but they have the same books, but they appear in a slightly different order. So I think it ends up being about custom. I had thought an interesting thing to do might be to, so one year when I taught this intro unit at Murdoch, or a larger version of it, and I went through personally and read the New Testament from the earliest written to the latest written to see how that worked. And that was quite an interesting exercise. And it would be, again, in terms of the proliferation of capitalistic Bibles as consumer products, it could be interesting to have a Bible ordered chronologically and to read it in that way.
And one point that I realised, actually when I was in church last Sunday, that the Bible was put together before really the idea of the Holy Trinity. So if you were just reading the Bible and you weren't going to church or otherwise involved with Christianity, that wouldn't be one of the most important points that would come out of it.
No, yeah, the Trinity, yeah, as a doctrine wasn't, isn't in the Bible. There's one verse in King James Version that comes from a very late manuscript, which has the formulation of the Trinity, and people like to point to that, but it's a late it wasn't in the original texts. So but also I think the doctrine of the incarnation, like a lot of the core doctrines of the tradition come from the later centuries, and they were based on the scriptures. Definitely the people who developed those doctrines didn't see them as being in conflict with the scriptures, but I think it's important to realize that they're not self-evidently there.
A question, Martin. I think it was on the flyer for this unit, there was something that's mentioned, there was somebody other than Jesus who was saying similar things.
Was that on one of the, did I promise that in some of the marketing material?
Yes, it was. Yes,
Yeah.
the marketing material.
I never delivered.
No.
Trying to think what the example was. I think it was Apollonius of Apollonius of Tyana. He was a Greek philosopher, Greco-Roman philosopher, who roamed, had an itinerant ministry, had disciples, had performed miracles, taught, had wise teachings and so on. And
I'm back to the whole.
it was, yeah. And who many people thought, I can just read this now, who thought that was the son, also a son of God, right? And I guess my point of putting that in the, although we haven't looked at him in particular, was that these kinds of beliefs and ideas were in circulation at the time and were applied to various great people within that context. So I guess what we did look at was how similar things would ideas were applied to the Caesars and the way in which that created a conflict with Jesus. But yeah.
But did he perform miracles? Like you're saying that?
Yes,
definitely
yeah, so
miracles?
in terms of the like Greco-Roman biographies,
Mhm.
there's a Greco-Roman biography about this guy,
Okay.
and that's how we know these sorts of aspects of his life. Yeah, you wait till the last 10 minutes, you're like, you promised. All right, I think that's a good time to wrap up. So thank you very much, everyone.
I think I will.
Thank you.
Very enjoyable.
So the last assignment you wanted by this Friday.